Okay, we're rolling to the finish here with subtype polymorphism. We're going to just talk briefly about this definitions and classifications thing. But again, the next kind of substantive chunk is the subtype polymorphism. So here's what it means. So we say that a function or an operator exhibits subtype polymorphism. And I'm going to start again with the words, and then we'll kind of backfill the intuition, okay? If one or more of its parameter types have subtypes. And the kind of the key takeaway here is that it doesn't have to do anything to get subtype polymorphism, okay? If there's a subtype, there's subtype polymorphism. Okay, that's kind of the cool takeaway, right? And then when you've got languages that have subtypes, which turns out object-oriented languages are very rich in the concept of subtypes, then you get subtype polymorphism. Let's go, actually, I want to do the object-oriented example first. I'm going to come back. I skipped over it real fast. I want to come back to Pascal. But in Java, which you know, or at least can follow here, I define this class that's just called a car, and there's a break function, method, right, for that class that I call car. And then I've got this manual car, which is a subtype of car. It extends car in the language of Java, and it's got a method called clutch. Well, generic cars don't have clutches, but manual cars do, right? So I add this clutch method. But because manual car extends car, it has by definition a break method that it inherits from car. Okay? Now down here what I've got is a function, again, function that's called G. It wants a car that it's going to call Z as a parameter. So you just pass G, and by the way, horrible naming in the slides, just horrible. Because it just obscures and makes it harder to grasp. But I've got this method called, or this function called G. It wants as a car type, and it's going to call it Z. And then for that particular car object, it's going to call Z.break, which means I'm going to go to that object I got, and then I'm going to go and call his break method. Okay. Now down here comes this function F that gets past a generic car that it calls X, and a manual car that it calls Y, and then it calls the brakes on X, calls the brakes on Y. So it passes X in to this G function, which then calls for X his break method, okay, which is going to be up there. And then for a manual car, same thing. I pass in the car. I call G with the Y. Y is now the thing that's dropped in here, and I'm calling Y.break, which again is the break method for Y. And so it's kind of again the use of single letter variables here is just heinous. So I apologize for that. But I think you get the concept, right? That remember that in object-oriented languages, when I subtype these classes, I'm subtyping, which feels like I'm getting smaller. I'm certainly getting more specialized, but I actually get more operations. I get everything I inherited, plus I get everything else I added. Okay, let's go back to Pascal, because this is interesting. It's not an object-oriented language, but it still gives you that subtype polymorphism. So first of all, again, going back to my Pascal days, but I'm declaring these types, and in this case, day is this set of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and basically it's an enumeration, and then weekday is basically a subrange of that. Okay, that's just declaring these types. I got a type called day and a type called weekday. Now I declare a function, and it turns out that in Pascal, functions and procedures were different. Okay, in funky kind of ways, and it's not that important, right? But other than to say that a function returned a value and a procedure did not. So in a procedure, I just went there and did whatever it said to do. There was no return value. In a function, there was a return value, And here it is right there. I'm going to return, it's over here in C that wound up over here in front of the function, right? As you've seen in C and C++. But that notion of C, which said everything's a function, in Pascal, there were different functions and procedures. Okay, so I've got this function which called next day, and I take a day, right? I take a variable that I'm calling D. Again, its syntax is backwards in Pascal compared to C. I have this variable I call D. He's of type day. Day is one of those big guys. And I'm going to return a day. Okay, that's next day. And then and the logic just goes, if D is Sunday, then next day is Monday. Otherwise, I just increment it. Okay. Now, then I go over here in the procedure where I pass in a day and a weekday. And the punchline here is that this day can be assigned. That's assignment in Pascal. It can be assigned, next day of D, and I can also assign D to be next day of W. Okay, and W is a weekday. And so basically, and I got to just say, I was actually noodling around. I spent a little bit of time on it, but ran out of time. I don't actually know. I don't really know what happens when you get over here, and if I pass in day, next day is D, I do have this loop around built in, right? If D is Sunday over here, then the next day is Monday, and I start but I can increment through here. But when I get to Sunday, I got to restart it. This range right here of Monday through Friday, honestly, I'm not even sure. I think what happens is that if I do the second one where W is a weekday, right? I do next day W, then it drops in here, and because weekday is a subset of day, right? It's a sub-range of these values through day, and I'm returning a value of day. So I take the weekday, right? I call next day W, and when I get inside here, it treats it like I passed in a value from this sub-range, but it's treating it internally like it's this full range. At which point, it doesn't matter. If I passed in this D and it was Monday through Friday, then the behavior is exactly the same as if I passed in this W and it's Monday through Friday. If that makes sense. The only difference is if I pass in D, it could be Saturday or Sunday. If I pass in W, it can't be Saturday or Sunday. But it still gets converted right here into a type day, and then my logic just goes and I return type day, and hence it's got to be assigned to a variable over here of type day. I hope that makes sense. And that's an example of subtyping in an imperative language of Pascal, but still it gives me that subtype polymorphism. Okay, and then later on when we get into the chapters, I don't remember when they show up. Chapter 12 maybe? I don't remember. Anyway, out in the front when we get into object-oriented stuff, 13 it starts to look at Java and some of that. Then we're going to see more about that subtype polymorphism. But for now, that's going to just be sort of adequate for now. And so I just want to point out, if you've looked at the slides just kind of by themselves, or even at the book in Chapter 8, down the stretch in the conclusion section of Chapter 8, there is this discussion of definitions and classifications. And I just kind of want to give you my quick take on that and end it, because it really doesn't merit a full podcast. But my struggle with the conclusion, and the reason I'm not, I'll show you, look, okay, there you go. Oh, look, there's a bunch of stuff. And the problem is, so go look at it if you care, there's actually slightly better discussion in the book in the conclusion section. And if you're, kind of digging this stuff deeply, I'd go there, and otherwise don't worry about it. From my perspective, it's like we had this nice discussion, and then in the very end, we're just going to spend 2.5 pages and just fire hose you with a whole bunch of definitions. And to me, it just really didn't help. Okay, I think we've got the definitions we care about, and more specifically, just kind of note that these are the 4 that I care about. Okay, overloading, parameter coercion, parametric polymorphism, subtype polymorphism. They do different things. They have different effects. You need to know what those effects are, right? And kind of how those get used in different languages, right? And that's really, that's good. That's plenty for me, and we don't need to kind of walk through all the rest of those definitions. We've already had the ones we care about. Bottom line, really, to just say there's a crap ton of other ways this stuff gets done in other, you know, in other languages, and it's just a big world, you know, and that's kind of the theme, and you got that already. So, okay, that is it for chapter 8.